I am happy to introduce Brett Scott to you, who has done so much for monetary diversity. He has been campaigning for cash. Cash is a part of currency diversity, which gives us choice. He is an author and a journalist writing about the intersection between money systems, finance, and digital technology. Brett is from South Africa and got a degree in anthropology there. He studied at Cambridge University and got a degree in, got a master in international development. And in the midst of the 2008 financial crisis, he worked as a derivatives broker. So that gave him very important experience. And since then, he focused on financial reform campaigns and a wide range of alternative finance projects. This brought him, amongst other things, to teach at Singularity University in Silicon Valley, being a senior fellow of the Finance Innovation Lab, an associate at the Institute for Social Banking, and an advisor and a member of the advisory group of the Brixton Pound, the local currency there. In 2013, he published his first book, The Heretic's Guide on Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money. It is a guide to the world of high finance and emergent forms of alternative finance, alternative currencies, and economic activism. That is why some people like to call Brett the money hacker. And in fact, he started an unboxing series where he explains how different cryptocurrencies function. Monneta published that unboxing series in German. Brett is today going to present his latest book to us, Cloud Money, Cash Cards, Crypto, and the War for Our Wallets. It takes so much effort to write a book, Brett. Could you tell us in the beginning, why did you write Cloud Money?
Sure, yeah. Well, it's good to be here. And so thanks for arranging all of this, and good to see all the people in the attendee list, some of whom I know from the past and different kinds of projects and things around alternative currency. Yeah, I've been involved in various forms of alternative currency experimentation, plus like mainstream finance stuff for quite a while. But yeah, maybe in terms of like why I wrote Cloud Money, as you said, in 2013, I wrote this book called The Heretic's Guide to Global Finance, Hacking the Future of Money, which was quite like a beginner's guide to approaching global finance, a guide to people who found themselves in civil society, who didn't know very much about finance, but who wanted to be able to approach the sector and to find ways of combating the power in the financial sector, but also to maybe build alternatives. And that book came out in 2013. And after that, I went around doing lots of speaking and collaborating with people who are involved in alternative finance. But what I started to notice as well was that lots of people in the tech sector, so in technology startups and different parts of the tech sector, often also perceived themselves to be involved in alternative finance. All right, especially with the rise of the fintech industry. And I was based in London when my first book came out. And the fintech sector was big there, and lots of people in the fintech sector had a kind of a self-image that what they were doing was alternative finance, right? So they started to pay some attention to my work. But there was quite a difference between what I was doing and what the fintech sector was doing. Lots of my work involved, how do you challenge the underlying values of, mainstream finance, build things that are authentically alternative. Whereas what the fintech industry was often interested in what they class as being alternative was the process of automating finance, basically taking an existing service that mainstream finance offered and then just automating it. And that's really what the fintech sector was all about. But they took on this whole kind of revolutionary rhetoric in the process of doing that. So I guess I started to become interested in the intersection between these tech players and finance players and what was really going on. And remember back in 2008, when the global financial crisis was really taking off, a lot of the big tech players were still sort of seen as being quite positive. Not people hadn't yet built up a kind of critical viewpoint towards big tech. And a lot of these big tech companies started to present themselves as being somehow this kind of alternative. But what I started to notice was that really, especially in the preceding 10 years after the financial crisis, the big tech companies are really starting to actually fuse with the financial sector, right? They weren't really challenging it. They were kind of fusing together with it and, creating these huge transnational architectures, digital finance architectures. Now, within that, I became very fascinated by this question around cash. All right. I started seeing these articles, especially around 2015 was when I started writing about this. I'd see these articles written in lots of the big newspapers where people would have this very uncritical viewpoint on why cash was in decline. It was always presented as if the reason why cash is in decline is that ordinary people just are naturally moving towards digital systems. All right. So this very sort of bottom-up way of presenting it, as if there was no commercial interests at play, or even government interests at play. So I started writing articles to counter that, and also to show the different types of money in society. And I guess that's led to cloud money. So it's come out of a variety of things. And I also got involved in sort of the crypto world, which I also bring into the cloud money book. So I guess it's a culmination of 10 years or so of going around the financial sector. But yeah, I'm going to give a presentation on it. In the presentation, I'm just going to do I'm not going to try to go through the whole book. I'm just going to give a basic overview of maybe the first 2/3, maybe the first half of the book. All right. In particular, looking at this issue around cash. So let me just share my screen. Yeah, the book is now out in about quite a few languages. It's coming out in about 9 languages or so. So, which is good to see. There's quite a lot of interest around the world in this topic, and yeah, it's definitely one of the most interesting things. Maybe I'll start with this point is that one of the reasons why there's interest around the world is that actually around the world, there's a prevailing ideology, all right, that tells us that if something is not digital, it will die. No matter where I go on this planet, I'm from South Africa. If I go to South Africa, if I go to the US, if I go anywhere, basically, there's a prevailing story, right? Especially among the political class or among business elites or innovation elites or journalists, that what human progress basically means is ever more automation, ever more scale, ever more interconnection, complexity, and speed. I mean, that's essentially it, right? There's this idea that what it means for a human society to progress, so everything to get bigger, faster, more complex, more automated, et cetera, right? And this image here kind of conveys the sort of generalized vibe of that. This is the kind of like future-facing imagery which occupies people's heads when you ask them to think about the future, all right? And this ideology just kind of pervades the whole world, right? Now, I would argue, and this is my particular bias, that this ideology is the latest iteration of corporate capitalist ideology, all right? This idea that it's naturally good for everything to get bigger and faster and more automated. When I look at this way of thinking, I see Amazon, right? I see these huge digital players behind this type of thinking, okay? I don't see ordinary human beings behind this type of thinking, even though ordinary human beings might have taken on this sort of ideology or internalized it, right? So that's one of my, I guess, sort of big things that I'm getting at least in the background, is that, across the world, there is this overarching ideology that digital automation, or so-called digital transformation, is inevitable and unstoppable and for the good of all people, all right? Within that overall category, then people start to make judgments about particular forms of money, okay? So when you ask people what they think about the cash system, many people love the cash system or have no problem with the cash system, actually think cash is, useful and fine, but will nevertheless have internalized the idea that somehow it will have to die, all right? They will nevertheless have taken on this idea that there's something archaic about it, that it will eventually transition into some kind of digital money or be upgraded into digital money, all right? And a lot of imagery of digital money, if you go into a Google Images search, will show you these pictures of cash kind of like dissolving into data or turning into information or flying through wires in some kind of sense. The idea then essentially is that digital money is basically like cash, but like more advanced, okay? So the imagery that's generated is a little bit like the difference between an acoustic guitar and an electric guitar, all right? People will say, well, they're basically the same thing, but one's just like more advanced and electronic than the other one, all right? And many people will have taken on this belief system of cash, right? Being the sort of outdated form within a kind of process of digital transformation, and therefore it has to eventually disappear, all right? Now, what this leads to in the public debate is a kind of a standard story, all right? And you'll find this story actually among not only people who are critical of cash, but also people who are actually pro-cash will often still use this basic framing here, all right? The idea is that cash is like the horse cart of payments, all right? And it's like old, inefficient, and dangerous. Okay, well, those are the anti-cash people have this idea that it's old-fashioned, inefficient, and dangerous, right? But even pro-cash people will sometimes have this idea that they'll say, yes, we understand that it's these things, but still, give people more time to upgrade to the digital systems, right? If you look, so many politicians, if I go to the UK, for example, and I speak to politicians there, many politicians who are concerned about cashless society will say things like, yeah, we understand that there's, that the digital payments are inevitable and an upgrade, but we have to give people more time because they're not yet ready for the cashless society. All the language is around this like idea of like an inevitable change, and they're sort of trying to stall it for a bit longer, all right? That's the whole sort of idea. And actually, this horse cart metaphor is quite telling because, there was a time in the early 1900s, for example, where there were people using horse carts and the automobile industry was taking off, right? Bear in mind, the earliest term for a motor vehicle was a horseless carriage, all right? So this whole idea was like, it's a more advanced form of a horse carriage, all right? And eventually these old guys who are still using the horse carriage will eventually have to get off the roads, okay? And you can imagine at that time, there were a bunch of like social, maybe some, social workers who would have maybe been concerned about the welfare of poorer people and stuff. They would say, look, give people more time. They like their horses, give them more time, right? And that's actually how this debate around cash versus digital payments is framed right now, all right? you'll find all these people concerned about who will be quote unquote left behind by the cashless society. You know, I go into like the BBC, they always frame their articles like this. The main problem of cashless society is that some people will be left behind. All right. It's like, you know, think about all the poor people who can't get a car yet and will be left behind because they're still using the horse cart. That's like the way it's framed. All right. Which I will challenge, but it's very, very dominant. Okay. Also, there's a second part to the mainstream ideology about the cashless society. And the second part is basically that the reason why it's happening is that ordinary people are driving this. All right. Now, this image here is an abstract way of looking at the economy. When I'm thinking of an economic system, I am seeing a vast, interconnected, interdependent system. All right. We're all tied together in webs of interdependence at very large scale. All right. We often struggle to see these webs of interdependence because we're operating at such a massive scale in our economy, but all the people that surround us as we walk out into the streets at some level are connected to us via markets and via huge interdependent market systems. All right. Now, within standard economic ideology, let's say it's mainstream ways economics is presented, it's often imagined that the ordinary consumer, the sort of small player who's like walking around the streets, is the one who has the most agency in the overall network. All right. So if you imagine this network here to be all the small players on the outside are like the individual person, the individual worker, the individual person who's like going to buy stuff and like go to their jobs. And those big nodes in the middle are like big companies. All right. Within standard economic ideology, it's often implied that actually it's the small little players who are not coordinated who have the greatest amount of agency in the network. So if you ever see these like articles that say things like consumers opt for digital payments, okay, it looks like a kind of banal heading, but basically what they're saying is people are choosing and desiring digital payments, and they are the ones who are driving this. All right. These articles will never say something like the corporate sector that controls the entire payments architecture is slowly eroding the cash system to make it ever more likely that people will be forced to opt for digital payments. All right. It's always somehow the agency resides with the little player. Okay. And this actually applies beyond the question around cash. This ideology is present in many, many other things in our society. All right. So those are the two sort of dominant ways this issue is being framed, that cash is this outdated and sort of old form. It's old, inefficient, and dangerous in various ways. And most people are just opting to move away from it. And they are the ones who have the agency, and this is why it's happening, right? This is why there's a decline in cash usage, especially in places like the UK, for example, all right? In Germany, this process is still a lot less developed. People have a much sort of stronger pro-cash kind of perspective. But if you arrive in London right now, so many people will have internalized the idea that there's something wrong with them if they, quote unquote, still want to use cash, right? They basically be made to feel like somebody who's using a horse cart. It's like, oh, shame, you're like still this person who does this thing. Haven't you yet realized that you should have upgraded? All right, that's what the sort of vibe is. Okay. I'm going to quickly do two metaphors to break the story, or to at least cast doubt upon it. Some of you who follow my work might already know some of this metaphor stuff I use. But you know, when I'm doing public presentations on, you know, like let's take on, for example, the BBC or like a big news station, I often need these quick ways to convey the politics of this issue. All right. And so I'm forced to build these types of metaphors to help people quickly grasp what's at stake and how things are working. All right. So the first of these is that Euros in bank accounts are digital casino chips. All right. And confidence in them is underpinned by cash. All right. Now, one of the biggest problems we have in our society when talking about money systems is that many people, and I mean, I know the monneta network is probably quite unique because people are well versed in money and spend lots of time thinking about it. But if you speak to ordinary members of the public, monetary understanding is very, very poor, right? And that's not a critique of the public. It's partly the legacy of economics, which is a very poor record in actually teaching about money. But it's also just very, most people just don't really think about it very much. They're born into monetary systems and don't spend much time trying to work out what's happening. So when they hear the word euros, they think that basically it's a single currency of some sort, right? Or if I'm in the UK, a person hears the word pounds, they think, well, the pound system, it's a single currency system, right? When in reality, actually, the pound system is a whole ecosystem of different types of money issued by different players, okay? And the easiest way to show this to a person is to get them to think about a casino, all right? So you say, imagine you arrive at a casino with $100 in cash, all right? Government issued money. You hand it over to the cashier, what do they give you? They give you casino chips, all right? They're issued out to you privately by the casino. Those casino chips are a secondary form of money that can be used within the casino. But the only reason that you believe in those chips is that you believe you can take them back to the cashier, again, to redeem back for cash at some point, right? So you have this kind of these two forms of money that are now tethered together. The casino has taken ownership of your cash. They've issued you these privately issued chips. And those privately issued chips will derive their own power from their association to the cash behind the cashier, right? It's very easy for somebody to understand this. It's like, okay, I can make a distinction between a casino chip and the cash, right? Now, this is actually very similar to the modern banking system. If I hand cash into a bank, they're not keeping it for me. They take ownership of that cash, it goes into their reserves, and they issue out digital casino chips to me, right? And that's what you see in your bank account, right? For most people, this comes as news to them. They had never realized that the units in their bank account are a different type of money to the cash that they put in, for example, all right? And so when people realize, it's like, oh, actually, these digital units are a privately issued form of money by my bank. So, for example, Chase Manhattan Bank or Barclays Bank. And this is a very good way to initially show somebody this distinction. And from there, they can start to work out. They say, okay, well, actually, if these digital units are tethered back to the cash system, is it truly the case that the digital money is some kind of upgrade to the cash system? Is a casino chip an upgrade to the cash behind the counter? Or is it a sort of tethered symbiotic form? All right. So that's a very powerful metaphor for many people. And also from this, we can start to work out some of the politics of what's going on as well, right? Because obviously the banking sector who's issuing these digital chips has a bunch of interests in promoting the usage of those chips, all right? They get fees from payments. They get data from payments. They get generalized societal power from entrenching themselves as the payments infrastructure. Now, in my newsletter, Altered States of Monetary Consciousness, I sometimes draw these slightly strange pictures of these like flying the banking sector hovering above society. That's what this image here is, all right? So you have society down below and stuff. And then I'll do these images of, the central bank with the banking sector sort of tethered into it. And they're all sort of intermediating payments, all right? And of course, there's huge economic interest in the banking sector to entrench themselves as the primary way that you interact with other people in society. Of course, the cash system stands in the way of their dominance of payments. All right. Now, if you're in Berlin, where I'm based, I can walk out into the street and I can make a choice between using cash or using my card. Right. There's still a sense that actually it's a balanced system. If I go to London, that's gone. in London now, I basically cannot interact with another person unless I go via this huge structure. All right. And of course, there's another big player, which is the card companies that basically intermediate between the banks, the bank accounts. All right. And essentially in London now, I cannot operate unless I ask Visa and MasterCard. All right. That's huge structural power. Okay. Of course, these players have interests. And often when people are when you're trying to sort of rebalance the debate around cashless society, what you got to do is show how these top-down players firstly have this interest in eroding the cash system, but also how they've literally engaged in propaganda campaigns against the cash system. All right. This is sometimes called the war on cash, you know, which is, remember the dominant story is that all the change is happening because everyone down on the ground in society, the sort of ordinary person, is, you know, wishing for a cashless society from the bottom up. When in reality, there's all these top-down processes as well, where these big players are trying to erode confidence in the cash system and also erode the infrastructure to make it harder to use, right? And this is why when I see this term cashless society, it really annoys me, because it's a little bit like referring to whiskey as beerless alcohol, or AC/DC as a folk musicless band. All right. It's a very evasive way of describing the situation. What a cashless society is a society that's essentially dominated by the banking sector and big tech. All right. That's what it is. Unfortunately, there's not a catchy way of phrasing this. I'm still looking for a word that will say what this actually is, right? Whereas cashless society, everyone sort of just thinks like it's some kind of strange upgrade, but really it's a kind of a takeover of the payment system by big corporates, right? And from there, that allows various government players to have lots of forms of power as well, all right? So really, when we go back to that picture of that economic diagram I mentioned earlier, the standard narrative is that all the little people on the sort of sides are the ones that drive, whereas I would argue that at least as much, if not more, of the power is residing in the big corporate players who control the payment system and have the ability to shift culture. And also, when those players operate together and all move in the same direction, they can pull the entire economic network with them, all right, regardless of what ordinary people want, okay? Economists don't like it when I say this, because it goes against the ideology that the consumer is in control, right? They're like, how dare you say that the ordinary person doesn't have their desires met by the market, all right? Whereas my perspective is that, well, the market is dominated by oligopolies, so the desire of the market really is the desire of the oligopolies, all right? And of course, this is a controversial political point. I can show lots and lots of evidence for this, though, all right? And I don't have time to go into all of it now, but there's many things that the banking sector does to undermine the cash system. For example, they shut down their branches, which makes it harder for businesses to deposit cash, which in turn makes it more likely for businesses to, quote unquote, go cashless, which of course sends a message into the public that there's something unacceptable about cash, all right? They close down ATMs as well, reducing access to cash. But it's not only the banking sector, right? It's all these big corporate players as well will often enter into deals with each other, because actually corporates prefer to deal with each other than to deal with sort of the ordinary person. So here's a very good example of the National Football League in the US, who entered into this deal with Visa to host cashless Super Bowls, right? And this was a 2019 deal, all right, where they basically said, Visa said to them, if you want our sponsorship, basically you're going to have to make these cashless Super Bowls, right? And the NFL agreed, okay, because it was in their interests. The first of these cashless Super Bowls, though, was launched in 2020 after the pandemic hit, and the framing around it was all made out that it was because of the pandemic, all right? But of course, this deal was signed in 2019. It had nothing to do with the pandemic. It was an automation play by these big players, right? Even Lufthansa, you know, these corporate executives, they always say things like, oh, you know, we only do stuff because our customers ask for it, all right? Lufthansa has started refusing to use cash on board, all right? I guarantee you if Lufthansa went to the German population and polled them and said, do you want us to prevent you from using cash on board Lufthansa flights? They would get an overwhelming no. We don't want you to take our choice away, right? And yet they will do it nevertheless, all right? Because this is a top-down corporate profit optimization decision, all right? This is what happens in large-scale capitalist systems when big companies are trying to automate and they have enough power to override what their customers think, all right? That's exactly what they do. And there's many of these examples I could go through. For example, Visa trying to incentivize these small businesses to all go cashless, and in so doing, to send these cultural messages into society about cash being on its way out. All right. Let me quickly end though with this second metaphor that I'm using to kind of go on sort of counter-offensive. I mentioned earlier that the sort of standard narrative is that cash is like the horse cart of payments, all right? And all these digital players and these big companies rely upon this narrative that there's something inevitable about the takeover of digital because it's more advanced and more upgraded, and progress means we have to do it, okay? The public bicycle metaphor, though, really messes with this, okay? And this is why I love this metaphor, all right? So this is the standard framing right now. As soon as you change the idea of cash being to the public bike of payments, people suddenly realize they can very quickly grasp that the sort of pro-digital ideology is shallow, all right? Bicycles were an earlier form of transport than the car, and yet they're more popular than they've ever been before. There's nothing about something being old that makes it out of date or old-fashioned, all right? There are many things in our society that are technically old that will keep their popularity, all right? And the other core part of this reframing is to say, you know what? Digital payments are not like the car. They're actually far more like Uber, okay? And I don't know how many of you guys use Uber or these other types of taxi apps. But basically, an Uber system, I'm relying upon a third-party institution in order to be able to travel, okay? You can immediately now see the difference between these two things. One of them is gives you autonomy, all right? The other one offers you some kind of convenience of some sort, but it does make you dependent upon some large corporation, all right? And this is what is a good, the transport metaphor is great because it shows these different types of pros and cons in a society. If you ask somebody, do you find bicycles or Uber convenient? They'll say, well, it really depends on the context. I actually like both of these, all right? I sometimes like using my bicycle. I sometimes like using Uber. I don't want to be dependent on either one, though. I don't want a society where the only way I can travel is by Uber, all right? This is why this is a very good way to frame this question around cash versus digital payments. Cash is essentially the bicycle of payments, whereas digital is like the Uber of payments, all right? Now, things like Uber are only empowering insofar as we have an option to not use them, all right? If I'm stuck in a society where the only means of transport is Uber, we'll have huge problems. It'll become very oppressive, all right? It grants an enormous amount of power to essentially a corporate player. There's huge surveillance problems. There's resilience problems, right? The system goes down, everything fails. There is forms of political capture, all right? If the only way you were able to move around a society was by using Uber, Uber would have immense political power, all right? And you can start to use this transport metaphor as a way to show all the implications of a cashless society. You say, look, if you actually were forced into these digital payment systems and they're the only way you were able to operate, we'd have huge surveillance issues. We'd have massive censorship problems in the sense that these oligopoly of banks and big tech players would essentially control our ability to interact with each other. We'd have huge resilience problems in the sense that if their systems go down, the entire economy starts to essentially freezes, all right? You have massive exclusion problems in the sense that if you can't get access to their systems, you basically cannot interact with the economy, all right? Or if you don't want to get access to their systems, you're basically forced out, right? And this is happening in London right now. You'll see essentially a dual economy forming. But also, it's an attack on localization, all right? Cash is historically associated with the small-scale, localized transactions between human beings, whereas these digital systems are associated with super large-scale interactions with digital corporates, right? In a cashless society, every single local transaction has to go via a super large central intermediary, all right? Which means every single local interaction makes a central intermediary somewhere else more powerful, all right? And this is why I think we reframe this cash as being the public bicycle of payments. I think I'm going to maybe end it off there. The book obviously goes into a lot more of the stuff. I talk about how this attack on cash is basically required for the fusion of big tech and big finance to take place. And then also how the crypto movements have often perceived themselves as being a kind of decentralized counterattack on that kind of centralized digital conglomeration that's forming, all right? One of the big things about the crypto movements, though, and I can talk about this of course, is that actually they're starting to form a distraction from the important real-world task of actually maintaining a balance of power in the existing monetary system by protecting the cash system. So I'm going to end it there, and then we can have a discussion.
Thank you so much, Brad. That is very helpful, and I like your metaphors very much too. I think they are very helpful to get pictures in mind and to remember what you said better. And I realized that in your book, you didn't use much math and figures, but more metaphors. And I realized that many people like to compare money to blood or to blood circulation. And you like more to compare it to the nervous system. Why do you think the nervous system is a better metaphor for money, or the monetary system?
Oh yeah, that's a big it's a big question. Yeah, look, okay, it's just so there's always a risk of overwhelming people with metaphors or metaphors clashing with each other. I use a lot of metaphor. Not everybody likes metaphor. I just used two metaphors in this one, which is around like casino chips and then the public bicycle or the bicycle system. But in the early parts of Cloud Money, I was using a broader metaphor to talk about money more generally, all right? And I was pointing out that historically there is this tendency of people to imagine money as being a kind of like a substance of value, the sort of thing that pumps around the economy, right? Actually, when I was working in the financial sector, lots of bankers like to imagine themselves as being the kind of heart or the sort of, providing the sort of the blood flows of the global economy, like they were the beating heart of the global economy was finance, right? Pumping sort of like money to the industry. So all the kind of imagery was of this like substance being pumped around, right? Now, I could talk for hours about this because there's a long history in monetary thinking of commodity imagery being used for money. It also has a sort of complex psychological sort of background to why that happens. Many people in large-scale economies often start to imagine money as being a commodity precisely because it's the sort of it forms a kind of folk mythology of how money works, all right? Because they can't really see the institutional legal structures. But regardless of the source, basically there is this common sort of idea that money is a kind of like a blood that pumps around the economy. And I hate this metaphor, all right? To me, the monetary system is far more like a nervous system, all right? Albeit a nervous system with different sort of forms within it, all right? This is why I was saying there's not one type of, we have these, the cash system, you've got the digital systems. So it's a kind of a complex nervous system. But in reality, the financial sector is far more like a kind of, if we're using this big sort of nervous system metaphor. It's more like a kind of this might get too complex, but a kind of a motor cortex. All right. Like the motor cortex is the part of your brain that turns thoughts into action. All right. It basically sends signals via your nervous system to activate your muscles. All right. And actually, if you're looking at this as a sort of metaphor for the overall economy, really what the sort of underlying like value in an economy is human beings and natural systems. That's where everything comes from. All right. But we all linked together into the sort of vast, shall we say, a superorganism. Okay, and we're the sort of underlying body, but the financial sector is able to kind of activate whole sections of that. And that's far more like a nervous system than a circulatory system, right? I didn't explain that perfectly well, but it's the nervous system stuff becomes a lot more useful for sort of seeing about how many sort of monetary processes work.
Yeah, I agree. And in fact, you ask what might be the right expression. A friend of mine, a journalist, I heard her say, we are on the way sort of into a digital totalitarian. No, what is it in English?
Totalitarianism.
Yeah, exactly. That was the word. And I would like to know, well, nobody knows what the future will bring, but what would be your worst case and how could we turn it out better?
Well, look, I mean, in the 1970s, there was this kind of a branch of science fiction that emerged, which is called cyberpunk. I don't know how many of you have come across cyberpunk, but it's like films like Blade Runner and Minority Report. Actually, on Netflix now, there's one called Altered Carbon, which is like a very classic, sort of like a weird retro remake of like cyberpunk, right? And cyberpunk basically, you know, in the 1970s took processes that were happening already in global capitalism and projected them forward in time and extrapolated. And basically what you end up seeing is vast inhuman scale economies where basically ecological systems are being destroyed. All right. Human beings no longer have any connection to ecological systems. All right. You know, things like Blade Runner, the original like book around that, they sort of fixated on finding like actual real animals, right? It's because I've never seen them before, right? So there's total disconnection from ecological systems, huge domination by corporates who basically fused into governments, right? So when you look at dystopian scenarios, this is the kind of thing when you look at, right? Well, this is the kind of digital totalitarianism type of vibe that starts to come when you project forward in time. So I try to steer away from pure dystopian scenarios because I think that human beings do form political resistance to things that are happening in the world. But yes, we are definitely seeing a move towards, firstly, the fusion between big finance and big tech, all right? But within that, these large-scale nation states inserting themselves into that process in order to exert power. And within that, then they're kind of like a geopolitical struggle as well, right? With sort of China and the US and these sort of different spheres of essentially digital corporate influence, all right? And that's definitely happening at a global scale, all right? I was just, for example, I was doing an interview in Singapore a couple of days ago, an online interview, and the guy was saying there, he said, you know, recently we've had this minister of ours attacking people who are using cash, saying they're like out of date and like bringing the society down. All right. When I see that, I see somebody who's basically has had their mind infected with a kind of a sort of a mind virus, right? Which is this idea that everything must turn into a vast intermediated formal system, right? That like, it's not okay for human beings to do ordinary peer-to-peer interaction with each other. They have to go via massive financial institutions, right? And that is a kind of a dystopian vision for lots of people. Unfortunately, right now, the main group that's raising awareness about this is actually the right wing, all right? I'm definitely a very left-wing person, but there's lots of these like people from the sort of conspiracy theory right who are sort of catching on to the fact that these processes are happening and then spinning these conspiracies around it, right? So I'm not sure if I'm answering your question, but yeah, we have some very dystopian trends in the world. And I would argue that it's because of the processes of large-scale corporate capitalism. But I believe we can fight against this.
Okay. Well, in a few minutes, I would like to come to the questions of the audience. So then I would like you to raise your hands. And before that, Brad, I would like to ask, there are some people in the audience who are very interested in complementary currencies. And which complementary currencies, from your point of view, would have a high potential for future development? Are there any?
I mean, there's always potential. I mean, look, bear in mind the risk of me writing something like Cloud Money is it presents these big sort of like meta stories about like big processes. But of course, human society is messy, right? It isn't actually a simple story like that. There's lots of, diverse processes going on. And of course, there's always space for interesting alternatives, right? And historically, in alternative economy movements, of which, monneta would be part of this tradition, there has been a belief that you can form these sort of like marginal sort of counterpower systems, right? Small scale systems that either complement or the sort of normal system, or else provide some kind of like balance to it, right? And of course, there's always potential for that. And it's always important that we do that because it's kind of like it shows that we're alive, all right? It shows that we believe in things when we try to build alternative stuff, right? And of course, I've been involved in local currencies. There's lots of sort of practical uses of local currencies you can do. I've been involved in sort of, mutual credit systems. I really like mutual credit systems because the money geek in me really likes them. There's people on this call, I'm sure, who, like Leander, for example, who knows lots about this sort of this stuff. And yeah, I think one of the interesting things that's happening right now in terms of alternative currencies is, some of the people who are trying to sort of fuse some of the earlier thinking on alternative currencies from, say, mutual credit and sort of fuse it with some of the crypto movements. As you probably all know, the sort of standard cryptocurrency communities, like the Bitcoin community, often have extremely regressive, what I would consider regressive viewpoints on money, very like commodity-based like thinking, often very conservative style of thinking about money, that they're then sort of implementing on quite a radical technology. And I think what's exciting is people who are trying to use that underlying technology, but with a more progressive viewpoint on money. So like bringing in the traditions of things like mutual credit and trying to actually implement it, or hybridize these systems. So I think there's actually quite a lot of stuff you can do in that space. I mean, I'm giving a very generic answer. But yeah, I mean, in terms of, the last thing I'll say, if we go back to that metaphor around money being a nervous system, all right, in our own nervous systems, we have different parts of our nervous system. We have a central nervous system, which is like, the brain and the spinal stuff. And then we have the peripheral nervous system, and an autonomous nervous system. They're sort of different parts of the nervous system. And actually, you can start to think about different parts of the monetary system as potentially having these types of features to them. So our central nervous system is like the sort of mainstream digital money systems, connected into these big central players. I think the cash system is actually quite like a peripheral nervous system, right? It involves a lot more human interaction at a localized scale. But you can almost think about these sort of small scale alternatives as being like an autonomous nervous systems. I don't know how far I want to push that metaphor, but I think there's actually, if you're thinking about how you're building an overall structure, you kind of want these different parts to complement each other.
Yeah, well, I would like to come to the questions of the audience, because I know our audience knows very much about money and currencies as well. Leander, are there any questions you could give to Brad?
Yes, so these are from the Q&A function. So if you
would like to ask questions, please raise your hand.
Yes, that I was about to say. You don't have to use the Q&A function to write them. You can also now raise your hands and we'll call you and you can speak them. We'll unmute you. But to start off with one from the Q&A, Stefan Oxenford would like to hear more about Facebook's or Meta's digital currency project. How would you, Brad, frame the value coined by Meta? Last name for it was DM.
I mean, I haven't been focusing on what the latest version of it is, but the original version was Libra. Interestingly, I was actually working on an EU funded project. It's called Decode, which was about building alternatives to big tech, right? And one of the teams on Decode got poached by Facebook. Facebook came in, swooped in and stole the team in order to build Libra, all right? They basically took the whole team and took the technology, which is a pretty classic, like, kind of ironic thing. This like EU funded project got raided by Facebook in order to carry on with its Libra project. But yeah, Libra was in the realm of the stable coins. Stable coins are one sort of big new topic in sort of monetary politics. And I think to go back to that sort of casino metaphor I was using earlier, we have these multiple layers of money in our society, right? So you'll have like the state money system, which is this, cash. And then you'll have the bank money system, which is these digital casino chips issued by the banking sector. But then there's these third tier players like PayPal, for example, who will take like these sort of bank issued units from you and then issue these like corporate units to you. So like a unit in a PayPal account is like a chip for state money, all right, at some level, right? And so PayPal's a third layer player, but these stablecoin systems are the same thing, really, just implemented using a different IT structure. All right. So and what the original Facebook Libra project was a kind of like a stablecoin system backed by multiple different national currencies. All right. And so one of the big like politics around it for nation states was to say, okay, all our citizens have access to things like WhatsApp and Facebook and stuff. And imagine Facebook now comes in and starts trying to sort of claim that what it's offering is a new currency, but really what it's going to do is trade our national currencies in the background. All right. It becomes an attack on our monetary sovereignty at some level. It probably ends up empowering the US dollar because Facebook is probably going to trade away your national currencies to buy US dollars or something like that, right? So a lot of players were very concerned about that. So Facebook scrapped that and then came back with DM, which was like a kind of a sort of standard stable coin, which then got sold to another player, all right, called Silvergate, I think. I haven't followed what's happened since then, right? But basically, these are corporate players trying to like sneak into the sort of third layer of the monetary system. But again, these are, there's lots of the same stuff at stake. They get data freeze, etc. I'm not sure if I'm fully answering your question, yeah, but like there's, maybe the last thing I'll say is that right now in monetary politics, two of the big topics are CBDCs and stablecoins, all right? So CBDCs are as kind of like if we're thinking about the monetary system and being in layers, all right, like layer one being these like state players, layer two being the banking sector, layer three being players like PayPal and these stable coins. In a way, the politics right now is around people often focusing on CBDC, which is these proposals for the layer one players to issue a new form of digital money, and then stable coins, which are these like corporate issued layer three tokens. And in the middle, we have the banking sector that kind of potentially is getting affected by both of these. All right. This is a very crude way of summarizing the politics, but this is kind of like, yeah.
But for those who haven't read your book yet, could you just say what CBDC stands for, so people might not be familiar with
central bank digital currencies? Actually, if you want to see my latest stuff on central bank digital currencies, don't read. It's not the book is not the best place. My newsletter, Altered States of Monetary Consciousness, or brettscott.substack.com. I put a new piece on there which describes all the politics of CBDC. But you're going to probably start seeing that popping up in the news a lot more. The problem about writing a book on money is that the news is constantly changing. So when you publish it, all sorts of stuff starts changing, from that point. So there's a bunch of new things that have happened in CBDCs.
Yeah, your newsletter is very interesting, and the last one I enjoyed very much too. Now we have one question from the audience.
I asked the questions about CBDC. There are different kinds of implementations. They haven't decided yet which one to take. But there are some words like wallets and tokens. And as I understand it, that would be exactly like money in your purse. Is that true?
Yeah, so I'm not following all the latest technical developments in CBDC, but the basic two options are, forget about the specific terminology that they use, but basically it's like, are you going to have an account where you're required to identify yourself, or is there going to be some sort of crypto-like architecture where you can control the units without a person knowing who you are, essentially, right? Bear in mind, in the traditional monetary system, cash is a bearer instrument, all right, which means like if you hold the units, like let's say this is a cash unit, if I hold it, I'm in control of it. You're not required to know who I am in order to be able to interact with me. I can just hand it to you, right? Whereas with the traditional banking sector, you have an account which identifies you by name, and you can only get that account by handing in various details about where you live and etc., how old you are, and they'll know who you are. And then you contact the bank asking them, identifying yourself, saying, hey, I am Edward, please alter my account, move digital chips from my account to somebody else's account, all right? Those are the traditional two options. What's interesting in the crypto world is the crypto world kind of invented a sort of hybrid third option, which is a means of having a system whereby you control the ability to move the units, all right, but a third-party player is required to actually do that for you, all right? It's like a kind of a strange hybrid between cash and digital money, all right? In the normal digital money system, the digital money players can move the money without me asking them to do it, all right? They have that power, but in the crypto world, they can't do that. But I can't move it unless they do it for me. So this is when people are talking about these like token-based systems, that's often what they're referring to in the crypto world. So in the case of like a CBDC, the question would be like, would you be sort of in control of it via a type of crypto-like architecture, or would you have to have a more sort of traditional banking type structure in order to move the units around? Okay. And from the perspective of the people who are working on that, there's a bunch of pros and cons to that. For people who are concerned about stuff like privacy, they want these more kind of token-based architectures. But if you're, say, a person who's interested in like concerned about, money laundering and stuff like that, you want this ability to be able to watch the payments through these like account structures. Sorry, this is kind of a sort of long answer, but yes, there's a bunch of politics about how a potential CBDC would be implemented.
As I see it, you get the money, you fetch the money, you have it in your cellular phone. And when you meet someone else, you can just, the phones communicate, and I can transfer money from my phone to the other person's phone.
Yeah.
Am I right?
So this is even like, so I mean, there's the people who are like really in the technical stuff and this can probably answer this better, but yes, there's actually these offline forms of digital money as well. And this is the kind of, in a way, if you're interested in the question around maintaining some degree of decentralization in these systems or privacy, these types of like offline peer-to-peer versions of digital payments are kind of the kind of holy grail, as it were. There's actually a person who writes about this is really good. It's Edouard de Jong. I don't know if you know Edouard de Jong, but he's sort of has a long history in cryptography and early digital money movements. Who's actually done a lot of work around how you actually build these types of kind of like what you're describing there, like kind of like a phone-to-phone digital payment, which historically has not been something people can do.
Lucas is next.
Many alternative currencies have, I don't know how to call it, a fading element built in, so that the value of the currency decreases or has to be re-evaluated. And this is much easier to do with a digital implementation than with cash, because with cash it's always complicated to implement it and it's expensive. So there would be an advantage of the digital approach. And how do you see the advantages or disadvantages concerning this kind of alternative currencies?
So in the case of digital currency, in the case of alternative currencies.
Yes.
Yeah, look, in the case of alternative currencies, this is something slightly different. Like, because bear in mind that the pro-cash position applies to the standard monetary system, right? And it can be summarized as, if you want to maintain a balance of power in the existing monetary system, you want that kind of like cash and digital money to be existing in a kind of a balance of power, much like the bicycle versus Uber, right? But this applies to the mainstream system. If you're now looking at an alternative system that exists outside of that, many alternative currencies are already on the back foot, all right? They're already in a situation where they don't have very much power. And of course, for most alternative currency players, they often find it easier to go with the mainstream sort of tendency towards digital automation, all right? And in that case, sure, it's easier to implement whatever type of alternative currency you're doing in a digital form rather than a cash form. I mean, even for example, when I used to do stuff with the Brixton pound, they had a kind of a cash form and a digital form, right? And many sort of alternative currencies have historically had this, the cash form of their token exists almost like as the kind of like the PR, the visual imagery and the sort of this tactile thing you can use to sort of promote it, but in reality, the digital system might be what actually people use, right? So in the case of alternative currencies, I'm not going to go and tell alternative currencies that you have to have a cash version of your alternative currency. So my pro-cash work really applies to the existing mainstream monetary system. But yeah, if you're trying to implement like a democracies system, I think that's maybe what you're referring to there. It's probably easier in a digital form.
Rolf Schröder had posted in the Q&A earlier that his view and interpretation of cloud money is that this goes beyond just money and finance and technology. It's about commodification in general. So is it about the expansion of the capitalist isn't it about the expansion of the capitalist economy per se? When thinking about alternatives, should we not rather think about talk about economic structures instead of just alternative money? What do you think, Brett?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. There is my book, one of the sort of big, I mean, I have quite a strong Marxist kind of element to my work, all right? And like, there's always like a historic sort of tension to some extent between like Marxist thinking and sort of monetary reform thinking to some extent, not always, but sometimes in the sort of monetary reform movements, you find this idea that like, you know, the problem lies in the money, right? If only you could change the money, then the system will change. Whereas in sort of Marxist thinking, they tend to Marxists often ignore money and then be like, well, everything's about the capitalist profit accumulation and expansion. That's what drives everything. But actually you can synthesize these positions. You know, the reason why banks, for example, create excess money through like credit creation of money is that they're seeking profit, all right? And they do that by accommodating these capitalist firms that are trying to expand and dominate through expanding, economic growth. So yes, the capitalist economy is held together by the monetary system, but it has these internal tendencies where it's always trying to expand and accelerate. All right. And in that context, right now, the cash system is standing in its way. All right. There was a point in time, let's say in the 1800s, when the cash system would have been at the leading edge of the capitalist economy. It would be used to accelerate things, right? But relatively speaking, in the position we're at right now in the global capitalist economy, it's become seen, the cash system is seen as something that's slowing the system down, right? It's not seen like that by ordinary people, but it's in the sort of the network structure of the global economy, it like feels like that to companies, right? So this is why there's an internal tendencies in global capitalism to try and constantly speed up and automate, etc., right? Which is why all this anti-cash ideology starts to emerge and seep into the culture, right? So absolutely, like there's internal tendencies that are sort of causing this to happen. But there's a bunch of contradictions as well, right? Because bear in mind, and this is again my like Marxist hat, the contradictions of capitalism. Capitalist firms will often do things individually that then end up screwing them over collectively, all right? So there are all these like big banks and big tech companies and stuff will act against the cash system, even though the actual stability of the monetary system upon which the whole of global capitalism rests is predicated on people having access to public money, all right? Those digital units that the banks use actually derive their own power and sort of psychological tethering to, through the cash system. So in a way, they're kind of like screwing themselves over, all right? So there could be forms of internal breakdown in the system if they actually did try to create a cashless society, all right? But yeah, I mean, one last thing I'll say about this is that one of the reasons why crypto movements have sort of captured the public imagination was actually that they don't go against the internal tendencies of a capitalist system, all right? So the internal tendency is to like expand, automate, get faster, accelerate essentially. But what the crypto movement said is to say like, we're not gonna go against the digital automation tendency. We'll just create a different version of digital automation. But a lot of people in crypto are actually pro digital acceleration, all right? They actually like the idea of like a gigantic digital architecture that gets faster and faster, all right? So what's interesting about the pro-cash position is that you're actually advocating for a slower, more high friction form of money, right? Which is actually dovetails more with like the degrowth movement in some ways, right? Saying we don't have to constantly accelerate the economy all the time. We can actually demand as human beings that we just like stay the same or slow down. It's actually politically possible to do that, all right? But of course, in alternative economy movements, people can also have this another way of channeling that same impulse.
Okay, well, I'll open another box then. Mary Sanderson says, now that we are learning that most of the money supply comes from commercial bank and is issued by them, how does that fit with your analogy of government money being the first layer and bank money, in brackets tokens, being the second?
Well, it does. It fits perfectly. So the question is about bank creation of money.
Yeah, I guess the difference, since the quantitatively bank issued money is more prevalent, more important, wouldn't that be the first instance in the financial system as it is now, and government money taking second position?
No, government money would still underpin the power of the bank money, but the bank money is much larger in quantity. All right. I mean, the best way to think about this again is using the casino chip metaphor I was saying. With a casino, you have a full reserve system, right? You'll have a person hands over cash at the casino and they get $100 of cash and they get $100 of chips. All right. You basically will have two forms of money there. There's a bunch of cash that's owned by the casino and then chips that are owned by the people who are in the casino, the punters, right? That's like initially a useful metaphor to convey the distinction between the different types of money, but it's an inaccurate metaphor in the sense that the banking sector is unique in being able to expand those chips that it issues out far beyond its reserves of government money, all right? And that's what's referred to as credit creation of money or fractional reserve banking. All right. So the banking sector can push out far more of this layer 2 money than it has in state money reserves. All right. And they will do that in order to essentially harvest loan agreements from the public. All right. So they will essentially, in a way, buy loan agreements by pushing out new money. All right. And that's why the vast majority of the money supply ends up being in the form of these bank issued second layer digital casino chips, as it were. All right. And that's where all the politics of monetary reform comes from, which is the fact that the banking sector can choose which parts of the economy to activate or deactivate by issuing credit, right? And they'll activate like housing speculation rather than like green energy, for example. This becomes a big political issue. But in the end, actually, those bank units are still deriving their power from their tethering at some level to the state system, right? They can't like disassociate from it. They can't actually like exit their association with the state money system, and I don't think they'd want to either, right? The banking sector relies upon. Like the banking sector is not in the business of trying to convince people of the stability of the monetary system. They want the government to do that, all right? And then they work all their stuff on top of that, right? So that's, I guess, my basic. And yeah, and what we call a cashless society is basically where we move into total dependence upon those like bank issued chips, which are created through that credit creation of money process.
Maybe I have another question for you, Brett, because I know we have students in the audience, and I would like to know, do you think that your perspective is adequately represented in economic teaching? And I think these metaphors are very helpful. What, from your point of view, is most difficult to explain to lay people, for example, or to students?
It's economic teaching. This won't be represented in economic teaching. Unfortunately, and I don't want to like straw man all economists, because obviously there's different types of economists in the world. But in general, economic teaching has a very crude and quite apolitical way of speaking about money. It doesn't really define what money is, other than through these very vague like functions of money. That it's sort of, sort of an economics textbook will just be like, money is whatever does this thing here. That's kind of how they say it. They don't really describe like what it is. They just say it's anything, it does this, and of course that like avoids the entire, like, it doesn't make distinctions between the different players who form this hybrid structure, legal, institutional, political structure of the monetary system. So the average economic student doesn't get taught the distinction between the different players in the monetary system and what their different agendas are. They often just think money is a kind of generic sort of thing that floats around. That's just the general vibe. And this is also then reflected in these kind of like, barter theories of money that are still prevalent in economic teaching, where they just imagine that it's spontaneously sort of came out of humans' natural tendency to trade, right? That's a sort of very standard economics way of thinking about money. They don't look at the politics and institutions and the history of it, really. So yeah, to understand, and one of the reasons why the public struggles to sort of grasp this cashless society question is precisely that that's the sort of dominant way they're taught about money. So they often lack the ability to make these distinctions. That they'll be like, oh, well, I guess if money is just a sort of generic thing, I guess the digital one's just a bit more advanced than the physical one, and it's just a natural evolution, right? Whereas if a person's sensitized to the fact that there's different players with different agendas and a whole history, they're much more likely to actually have a critical viewpoint on like what the different forms of money are and who's sort of like going to benefit, right? So of course, the debate is improving over time.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, let me try now to figure out if Jens Martin Joni, if we can hear Jens.
Hi, Brett.
Hey, Jens, good to see you.
I just wondered, before you told us about the points that cash is on the first layer, let's say, and I wondered if if this layer really would be cancelled, if really we had this cashless society, then we also they're somehow lost. The story is lost about this underpinning reason. You have the money is something commodical, and there's also a disciplinary instrument at the moment to keep the banks somehow in line to go on. So the question is, what do you think would happen really? Is there in that case?
I don't think anybody knows. I think it's actually a totally unknown question. The first thing I'd say is that I suspect, and not everyone agrees with me on this, but one of the reasons why central banks are starting to talk about CBDCs is that they realize that there's a problem when the public can't access layer one public money. There's financial stability implications. So they're like, oh, damn, we maybe start to, and I don't know if they literally think this in this like such a literal way, but this is like in the back of their minds is there's this sort of sense that's like, we run into problems with the digital casino chips issued by the banks if people basically realize at some point that those chips are not redeemable, right? And what happens, and it's an interesting point you raise about the sort of disciplinary feature, because as you say, I mean, people now can exit the banking sector, right? When there's crises, people exit the banking sector, all right? They do that by taking their digital casino chips and going to, and redeeming them for cash at the ATM and exiting the banking sector, right? What happens when you don't have that ability to exit? It must have a bunch of psychological implications, but also financial stability implications, probably like legal implications too. All right. I mean, imagine you probably need like legal scholars to like go into this, but like imagine the situation where you weren't able to like take a casino chip back and get the cash. And they said to you, don't worry, in the background, we'll send your bank some reserves. Right, but you know, it's like getting your cash back, but you're not going to be able to directly hold it. All right, and this is kind of what they're sort of in a cashless society they'd be betting on, is that people wouldn't demand to have this redemption ability. All right, or would have kind of forgotten that that's a thing. But I think it's a very understudied like idea. Like what would literally happen psychologically if people realized they weren't able to redeem their bank units. Especially in the context of like a financial crisis where there's a generalized reduction in trust in the whole banking sector, right? Like how do you then exit? And so, yeah, I'll give you like a very good answer, but I suspect a lot of the CBDC discussions have to be seen in this light right now.
There is another question from Heiko Erhardt.
Hi, Brett. Pleasure listening to you. So first, as some kind of killer argument for a cashless society, we often hear the fight against money laundering. So investigation agency and politicians, they claim they're not able to follow the trace of the money. So what's your take on this? And second, same as cash, cryptocurrency would also be on the kind of death list of the banks, since it locks them out of business. Transactions happen outside of their sphere of control. So do you believe that cryptos, and I'm talking about non-CBDC cryptos, will survive these attacks from corporates and corporate lobbyists?
So on the money laundering one, so as I mentioned at the beginning of the talk, there's the three lines of attack by anti-cash pundits. Firstly, that it's old, right? There's something wrong with something being old. Okay. Secondly, that it's inefficient, right? This is all the kind of economists, like it's slowing things down, it's friction, etc. Right? We must speed up at all costs. All right. And then there's the third body, which is that it's dangerous, right? And one of the things that's then used, that it's associated with crime, money laundering, tax evasion, whatever. Like there's a bunch of stuff essentially that, like, if you can't surveil people, they do bad things, right? Which is a generalized pro-surveillance argument that goes beyond cash, right? It's something that's applied to anything. It doesn't have surveillance in it. But yes. there will be this argument that somehow the cash system is a unique vector for like criminal activity, right? And there's two ways to approach countering this argument in general. You either point out that the digital systems are extensively used for criminality and tax avoidance and all sorts of like dodgy stuff, right? So you basically, what the anti-cash people are relying upon is they take a demonized view of cash and they compare it to a romanticized view of digital. All right, and the contrast then seems to like make you think that it's reasonable to be anti-cash, right? But the first thing to do is to say, well, the digital systems are extensively used for crime, right? I mean, this is like well known. The whole offshore banking sector is used for crime, and it's digital, right? The FBI has entire teams that specialize in just tracing digital payments, right? Because they are extensively used for criminality, right? So it's not something not like the cash system is the only vector for criminality. And also in some hypothetical cashless like future, you would probably have a massive spike in cybercrime. I mean, you'd have new forms of criminality that would adapt to the situation. So like the first thing to point out is that like there's somehow the criminality is not unique to the cash system. But the second thing is to say, even if it is, we have a holistic viewpoint which says there's pros and cons, all right? Now, much like my metaphor with a bicycle, I'm sure it's possible to use a bicycle for like dubious things. But on net, we can make a decision that in our society, we are trade-offs, right? And on net, it's best if we keep the bicycle system in play, because if we don't, a whole bunch of negative things are going to emerge, all right? So if you have a very zealous, like crime fighting kind of like guy who's like, let's destroy the cash system in the hope that we will marginally reduce some forms of crime, what's going to happen is that in the process, he's going to undermine the stability of the monetary system, create massive centralization of power, huge surveillance problems, massive resilience problems, huge exclusion problems. And those things outweigh the gains you get from the marginal reduction in crime that might happen, especially given that criminals use the digital systems as well. All right. Now that's the main way to approach this. I often get these like guys who come to me like this. Actually, I was in Italy once, and an FBI agent literally said this to me. He's like, if only we could destroy the cash system. You know, it's a little bit like, I mean, he didn't literally say this, but the vision he had was like, you know, criminals are like germs, and we've got to expose them to like ultraviolet light, right? And this is like the digital systems will like destroy all forms of criminality. And it's like, well, in the process, you'll destroy all forms of economic informality as well, all forms of like means of like political resistance. You'll destroy all sorts of other things that you actually value in the process. It's like, you know, an antibiotic, like nuking your entire like gut biome, you know, in order to like kill one small like, you know, bacteria. Like that's literally the style of thinking that they have, and it's incredibly destructive.
So given that normies kind of just have these assumptions that they kind of know what money is, or really their main concern is like, how do I get more of it? How do you think we can basically like expand normal people's curiosity in how these systems actually work and make them think that it's worth understanding?
I mean, I don't assume you can for most people. I mean, look, bear in mind, we live in a vast scale capitalist economy, which means for most people, they have to specialize and focus on what their more sort of immediate environment. Most people don't have the luxury to sit and dwell upon the nuances of every technical system in the world, right? So I don't for a moment assume most people are going to try to learn about the global monetary system. But you can certainly capture we certainly can try to like get like 10% more people to care, right? And that's maybe the main goal is to try and get like enough people to form certain types of like political resistance to otherwise unquestioned ideas. So in terms of how you do that, I mean, I don't know, that's a kind of a dark art or an unfinished sort of, I mean, in my own personal work, I'm often trying to write, you know, very accessible articles, forms of like, you know, metaphor. You know, as Katrine mentioned, I don't use any numerical graph-based imagery in any of my books. I only use more kind of like right-brained style of like of imagery for people. Like when I'm talking about monetary systems, specifically because I'm interested in humanizing our understanding of it. One of the big problems in economics and in sort of finance writing more generally is they try to like present it in these sort of like semi-scientific type of like ways, which is a sort of a terrible way of doing it, because it, you know, often when I'm talking about like money stuff, people say to me, oh, I don't know anything about money because I'm very bad at maths and stuff. I'm like, it's got nothing to do with maths. These are political systems. They're not mathematical scientific systems, right? They're legal systems, right? They're sort of social, cultural systems. So building more of that idea that it's like legitimate to have opinions on these subjects and that they're not scientific is very important. So I guess maybe, I don't know what you want to do in this process, but for me in particular, I'm often interested in translating these otherwise inaccessible economic kind of jargon language into like human language in some ways to help people in that way.
Then take the question from Marvin Landwehr, who wanted to follow up on you saying private issuance by banks can't really become the primary layer because they're still dependent on government issued currencies. So Marvin's question is why? Would it not be similar to the situation when the US dollar abandoned its connection to gold? Wouldn't it just be another untethering movement and it would find a new balance somehow?
Well, you'd have to have a description of how it would find a balance, right? Like, I mean, the history of gold itself is a very contentious topic, which is probably too big for us to go into here. It's questionable whether really gold actually backed those currencies, probably, but like, other than a sort of like, kind of like a psychological sort of backstop to some extent. But like, if you come from a kind of more like chartalist style of thinking, like I do, I'd say that the sort of primary kind of like anchoring in a sense comes to like political power, right? The state's ability to demand its own money back is what kind of can create a demand for that money. Whereas banks don't have that ability, right? Banks don't have the ability to like, they don't have their own independent means of tethering their units or like anchoring their units, right? Whereas a state does, at least to some extent, like a US state, for example, can exert political power to demand, like it's, you know, this is what sort of like the MMT movement will say, right? Like to some extent, not totally, but at least a significant element of the psychology of the money is related to the fact that the government has this ability to create the demand for it, right? And right now, banks depend upon that. You know, if the US Federal Reserve loses control, banks' units are going to be useless too. All right, the US banking system goes down as well when like the US Federal Reserve stuffs up. So it's like, I don't see how they overcome that. Right? I don't see how they develop their own. And this is one of the slightly bizarre things I heard when people talk about Libra originally. There were all these like articles coming out being like Libra is going to like, you know, become the new central bank. It'll determine. And I'm like, the Facebook executives have literally no idea on how to do monetary policy. They would have absolutely no idea on how they would like tether their own units. They don't want that to happen. They're relying on the central banks in the background, maintaining the system that they're then building on top of. And I don't think they would have the ability or the desire to sort of become the sort of, like the kind of monetary authorities. That's my intuition. I don't know, maybe feel free to give me an alternative take, Marvin.
Maybe we should have a look at the question of power as well, because in finance, it seems to me at least that we have a situation of David fighting against Goliath. From your point of view, what could we do, and maybe which rules would you like to change?
Oh, that's too big a question for me right now because, you know, I specialize to some extent. I have friends of mine who can give you better example, better answers to like what current regulations need to be put in place. Because bear in mind, in financial, combating the power of global finance is a you have to fight on multiple fronts. So I'm part of something called the Transforming Finance Network, where there's different groups who are fighting for different things, from, you know, like mandates for how banks should be able to extend credit, like, you know, being saying, you know, like, or something's called credit guidance, being like, you know, we should be pushing banks into doing productive forms of credit rather than unproductive forms of credit. There's like, that's like, for example, one thing in the banking sector. Like preventing a concentration of power in the banking sector is like a different thing, you know, like breaking them up, making them smaller, like giving them sort of a more localized mandates rather than, you know, turning them into these giant, like globe-spanning corporations that become disassociated from local communities. That's another kind of thing you can do. There's stuff, of course, in the fund management industry, all sorts of stuff, right? So yeah, I mean, look, and there's also groups like Finance Watch, for example, in Brussels, who are trying to lobby against the the banking lobby is huge in Brussels, right? And they've got massive like firepower, and the civil society doesn't really have a voice. So Finance Watch is there trying to like provide the civil society viewpoint, right? And like one of these things, for example, would be like protecting the cash system as a public utility, so we don't have to be totally dependent upon like the digital finance players, right? But yeah, there's like multiple fronts at once.
There's Lucas who has another question.
Another idea, and I would ask, Brett, I would ask your opinion about it. I have sympathy for the idea that I could accept my financial transactions to be transparent to others under the condition that all financial transactions of others are transparent to me and all others. So if we have a digitalized money and we are all monitorable, then we really should monitor our each other. And the reason for that is that I believe that a complete financial transparency of all actors would change our society in a very positive way and make a quick end to corruption and many forms of financial crimes. I think this is a kind of forward defense. I accept to be monitorable if anyone is monitorable by anyone. What do you think about this idea?
I mean, I think from a kind of more abstract philosophical position, it can make sense. It's kind of like a kind of Kantian, like categorical imperative type like thing. It's like if everybody does this at the same time, like, and maybe I'm probably misrepresenting that, but like if everybody does the same thing at the same time, we somehow get some optimal like outcome. I think it's a bit abstract in the sense that like the reality is that we don't live on an equal playing field, and that the chance of that happening is extremely low, right? In reality, financial transparency is like massively skewed. Like, and this is what, if you're a powerful player, you get to hide behind all sorts of like stuff like shell companies and confidentiality laws. But if you're a weak player, you don't. You have to be like transparent, right? That's the reality of the actual situation. In some hypothetical scenario that actually it was applied equally, then maybe there's a case for that. But you'd have to explain why the hypothetical scenario would exist. But even then, there'll be people who resist that. There's lots of people in the world who don't think like that, who don't think like you, right? There'll be lots of people who feel that that's like infantilizing, that actually, you know, this is quite interesting. When I go to societies with high levels of social cohesion, people sometimes feel like it's self-apparent that everybody's like working towards the same goal. Like in Sweden, for example, you go to Sweden and everyone's like, well, you know, it's fine that we're totally dependent on these large institutions and that everything can be seen because we're a good society. And it's like, whereas if you go to like Mexico or like South Africa, it's like, no, I don't want some like powerful player being able to like see everything I do because they might like screw me over. You know, it's like, so I think for your vision to work, you'd have to have a very high level of social cohesion, probably a high level of uniformity in the society, and also like somehow an egalitarian structure. But certainly you will find that style of thinking for some parts of both the political right and the left. But in some parts of the political left, for example, you'll find these like visions that like everything would be best if everybody was totally transparent about everything and everybody could see everybody else. All right. Like if you have no curtains on your windows, it stops people from behaving in a deviant fashion, etc. Right. The question of whether you want to live in that society is a separate thing, right? Like my intuition is that it's going to be difficult, but I like it as a thought experiment, potentially. Like I think you can maybe use that as a way to like maybe extract kind of like concessions from the big players that normally hide behind privacy laws. Right, like the powerful players that will. So, for example, I'm going on too long with this answer, but for example, the banking sector, if you're applying for a loan from the banking sector, they will demand to see a bunch of stuff from you. Like, we need to see your payments history. We need to see this history, but you can't go to them and say, I want to see your loan history. All right. I like the idea of being able to use a philosophical argument to kind of say, I demand to be able to see the loan history of this bank in order for us to do this deal.
And one last question from the Q&As, and we might not get through all of them. So if there's any unanswered, I'll just take a screenshot and send it to Brett in case you wanted to connect with these people asking. But just because it was also written so succinctly, Ringo Urban from Berlin also asks, what can I, as an ordinary person, do to promote cash?
I mean, I don't know. This is a work in progress. I think there's probably a lot of things that can be happening. So on the one hand, there's more kind of like bottom-up campaigns. What is happening right now, I'm starting to see people do forms of like small scale resistance where they'll like, you know, tell the owners of shops that don't accept cash that's wrong. They'll put stickers up. There's also these like forms of like sort of bubbling up grassroots resistance that's happening. All right, that's one kind of field, and I think there's a lot that we can do there in terms of like encouraging that. But then there also has to be sort of top-down pressure on politicians to take this issue seriously. All right, the main thing that we actually need right now is to build the cultural movements. All right, it's all very well. I mean, okay, in Germany is a unique case because actually in Berlin, for example, it's still totally culturally acceptable to pay with cash. But if I go to London, it's not. All right. If I go to London and I'm a middle-class person, I will be made to feel ashamed. All right. In which case, even if the UK regulator comes along and says, I require all shops to accept cash, as long as that cultural shame is there, people still won't use cash, right? Because they'll be like, well, the choice is there, but I'm going to choose to always use the digital because I'm trying to avoid the shame. All right. In that context, what's really needed is a cultural movement that says you should not be ashamed. All right. And this is why I actually use the bicycle examples, because there was a time like in the 1970s, for example, where bicyclists or cyclists didn't really have any rights. It was the motor vehicle industry basically dominated everything, right? The road system. And it took a kind of a coordinated cultural movement to come out and say, we demand pedestrianized areas, we demand cycling lanes, and it's totally acceptable for me as a person to want to be able to say ride to work rather than having to take a car. All right. And that's a similar thing that probably has to happen culturally to start build this movement to say, I should not be made to feel ashamed if I don't want to use this corporate form of payment. Right. So that's definitely a big thing. So anyway, none of these things have yet to actually be created, but there are definitely groups that are emerging. And like in Berlin, the best idea is to try and like curb it before it starts, right? Because right now in Berlin, the international middle class is moving in, or like people from like the US and stuff who are basically like often in the tech industry, who are bringing with them the cultural norms of essentially like transnational corporate capitalism, like Apple Pay, basically, right? And there'll be shops that start to sort of see that and say, okay, we're going to go cashless because we're going to try to target this international middle class. That in turn will start to send signals into the society that it's acceptable as a business owner to do that. And that's when the kind of cycle starts kicking in. So you got to like stop it before it gets before it accelerates.
Well, Hans Florian first asked, and I'll just read that out for everyone. Hi, Brad. Do you know of any attempt to merge a regional settlement system with mutual credit while generating some kind of temporary cash? Bank without license or regional money without legal tender all in one? A lot of jargon in there.
No, I don't. This sounds like something that Hans Warren knows about, but it's a merger regional settlement system with mutual credit while generating some kind of temporary cash. I don't fully understand that, but that sounds intriguing, and I suspect that maybe Hans already knows about something like that, or would know how to design that.
And you're connected, so you can follow up on that one too.
But I also wanted to address. I mean, so you mentioned this legal tender thing. This is quite an interesting area of the debate around cash being legal tender. And legal tender doesn't mean it has to be accepted. It means it has to be accepted for the payments of debts. All right. So if somebody's in debt, you cannot refuse. The creditor cannot refuse the legal tender. And in a sense, it's a way to prevent. One way of looking at it is it prevents creditors from stopping debtors exiting their debt. All right. So if you're trying to get out of debt and you're trying to offer legal tender, the creditor has to take it. This is quite interesting, actually, if you're in places like London right now and you go to a restaurant where they haven't explicitly told you that you can't use cash, and then you eat your meal and then you try to pay with cash in the end and they tell you that you can't use it. All right, you can pull out legal tender laws and you can say, actually, I'm in debt to you and you're trying to prevent me exiting my debt. You will have to take my cash. All right. And this becomes like an interesting kind of mechanism. But yeah, in terms of like legal tender status being removed from cash, which is I think what the question is, that would be a very controversial thing. And this is what I was saying earlier. There's a huge legal dimension to this question that people haven't really focused very much on. It's actually very questionable if you try to remove legal tender status. And actually, bank deposits or also essentially those digital casino chips that banks issue are not legal tender. And yeah, so there's a lot of like fascinating stuff around the legal tender question, but it tends to get misrepresented in the public. When I see people, they often imagine that what it means is that cash has to be accepted. All right. But yeah, really, it's about it cannot be refused for debt. Sorry, Hans Warren, I didn't really give you a very comprehensive answer to either of those, but it's been almost 2 hours now, so.
Yeah, maybe we should come to an end. Are there any more questions, Leander?
There are, but none that will be easy and succinctly to be answered, and some that I don't even understand. Wait, there's a new one from Antje Kennedy. What about the energy which we are having to use for all the digital systems and the amount we will of CO2 we will be producing? What if the IT system breaks down, like what happened at Lufthansa a few days ago in Germany?
Yeah, I mean, there's already been quite a few examples of these digital systems breaking down, right? And that's actually for like national security officials and people who are interested in like, contingency planning for like disasters. This is one of the biggest reasons that they get concerned about the decline in cash in any country. It's like, you have quite serious problems if you have a breakdown in these systems. And I think I'm actually, while it's true that there's a sort of prevailing sense in the public that somehow the cash system probably will start to decline, I don't think that will actually necessarily last. All right. So I have an outsider kind of position on this. I actually think we'll see a resurgence in cash popularity in the next 10 years. All right. And there's various reasons for this, because I think people are going to start to move out of the kind of like digital ideology, or at least the sort of the naive phase of that, right? I think people are increasingly becoming aware that digital systems are actually like kind of crap sometimes. They break down. So the whole kind of like mystique around digital acceleration is starting to like get more tenuous, right? also in the context of climate change, people are becoming aware of like the instability of large scale interconnected systems more generally, right? This idea that actually we can value the idea of like these sort of smaller scale systems. And also in the context of digital burnout, people basically like starting to realize that they're addicted to their phones. And actually in reality, digital technology isn't convenient, it's just sort of addictive, right? And that's really what's happening. We're becoming addicted to it. And I think that you could start to find these like backlashes to this idea. And all of this basically comes into this, this idea that actually you could see a cultural resurgence of people saying, you know what, like screw digital romanticism and let's think about a return to the analog. But yeah, it's definitely these every time there's a big corporate IT failure, it reinforces that message that actually maybe we shouldn't be depending on these like supposedly advanced digital systems.
Like to give the final remarks to Brett, and my final question sort of is what are you wishing for? And that sort of was my question about power. If you had all the power, what would you do, and what are you wishing for?
I mean, I don't really have a single answer on that. I often see the world in contradictions. All right. I don't really have a utopian mindset. I don't really imagine some ideal end society. I think, I often recognize that we sort of caught in these types of trade-offs and contradictions in systems, right? So I think often what I'm interested in is how do you maintain balances of power in a system such that more positive things emerge rather than negative things, all right? And, so in that context, like that's what really drives my work around cash. It's not that I'm like romantic about cash and I think, oh, everything would be great if everyone just used cash. I'm like, there's many problems about the normal monetary system, right? And maintaining the cash system is not going to like solve that. But in the context of where we're at, maintaining the cash system becomes an important way of preventing the worst excesses of the normal system from coming out. But of course, that's like one political goal. There'll be other political goals like, can we form more sort of like people-powered forms of money, which is a lot of what, the alternative currency movement sort of works on. I think that's I would like to do more stuff in that space. And yeah, I don't know if I'm fully, actually, you know what I'd really like? I mean, the thing in closing, I would like there to be more authenticity in our society. One of the things that really bugs me about the way that this issue around cash is reported on is it's so inauthentic, all right? It's always like, oh, it's so good because it's also convenient for consumers. This is why everything's happening. That's because we all want this. I would actually consider it a success if we just said, this is happening because it's part of the processes of global capitalism, and we don't really have much say in that. Like, that's not me saying, that's not me articulating a kind of utopian vision, but at least that would be a step forward and that people would recognize the situation, right? I often hate all the kind of inauthenticity that surrounds like digital messaging. So I would like a kind of like better balance of power and more authenticity in how we present our economic system.
Thank you so very much, Brett.